And now we get into the 1960s. Hopefully, you learned a lot about the civil rights movement. It started in the 1950s, extended into the 1960s. So that's kind of a perfect segue to go from the 50s to the 60s. Um, just like the 1950s, we're just going to go through this. We're going to show you some pictures, give you some basics, and hopefully go through this quickly for you. So, first thing about the 1960s is the expansion of television. That is something that's going to be synonymous with the 1960s. But in addition to expansion of it, you see more color programming starting to sneak in as the 60s moves on. So we mentioned that color TV was actually around in the 1950s, just wasn't very prevalent because there just weren't many things that were in color. 1960s is really where you start to see, color come into a lot of these shows. Some again iconic shows that were around during that time that were part of what the culture was. The Adams Family, you typically had people that liked the Adams Family or they liked the Munsters. Um, two kind of similar shows. You had the Twilight Zone, a little bit of drama there. Bewitched. You had the Andy Griffith Show, Mr. Ed, show about a talking horse. If you've never seen Mr. Ed, might look that one up. It was kind of one of my favorites just because it was just kind of silly. The Brady Bunch was extremely popular. Started in the late '60s, primarily known for the '70s though, and then the original Star Trek was going to be another big one. John the 23rd is going to become Pope during the 1960s. If we talk about who was the Pope during the 60s, John the 23rd is going to be the guy that we're going to look at the beginning, late 50s, early 1960s, but he's certainly going to be the one that is going to be kind of remembered. Now known as St. John the 23rd, obviously, we know him as John Roncalli. Uh, he was supposed to just be kind of a placeholder. Hey, he's going to be the Pope until we get the next, serious Pope in there. And the reality was, he came in and did a lot to make changes within the church. We're called the Roncalli Rebels because he was known as the rebel Pope. He came in and wasn't there just to kind of keep the seat warm. He was there to make changes to bring about new things into the church. So I'm sure through your religion classes you've had an awful lot of exposure to John Roncalli, Pope John the 23rd, Saint John the 23rd. But the 1960s is when he's primarily going to spend most of his time as Pope. There was a resurgence of the KKK in the 1960s. We've said all along since the Civil War that the KKK kind of goes through cycles. It kind of ebbs and flows. There are times where they're really, really visible, and then they'll disappear for a while. And then they'll be really, really visible, and then it kind of disappears for a while. Well, in the 20s, you saw the KKK was really visible, and then through the 30s and 40s, they kind of went back down into the 50s and 60s with the civil rights movement coming in. You saw the KKK kind of have a resurgence during that time period. The what they call the Grand Dragon of the KKK actually lived in Indiana. One of the leaders of the KKK in this area actually lived on Edgewood Avenue, not far from Roncalli High School. Mr. Tully would come in and tell stories about how he was living in the school, and it was not an uncommon thing for the KKK to show up and burn crosses on the circle. Back then, there were a lot of open areas. There wasn't a lot of homes around, so there was really one police officer to patrol the entire South Side. He would call the police. That one police officer would come at some point. The fire trucks would come with him, but by then everybody was gone. The fire was out. But that was a very real thing because the KKK was really anybody who was not Protestant, was not white, did not believe in what they believed in. and Catholics were included in that, along with Jews, African Americans, minorities, really anybody that wasn't going to be white and Protestant. Another thing that's iconic and associated with the 1960s is going to be Woodstock. August 15th through the 18th, 1969, basically a 3 day music festival. This picture here gives you an idea of how many people actually showed up to come to this. It was thought that originally it was just going to kind of be this little thing in the middle of nowhere, New York. And it turns into this huge, huge deal that everybody from that generation, you're going to hear an awful lot of people who are going to claim that they were at Woodstock. Well, looking at this picture, it'd be pretty hard to prove that somebody wasn't there. Give you another idea of the size of the crowd. It was just absolutely massive. A list of some of the acts, some of the biggest acts of the day, wound up being a part of this festival. Um, you look at the ticket prices down there, was pretty reasonable to get in, even back then, for that amount of talent. 1960, JFK, John F. Kennedy is elected. He is running. Kennedy's a Democrat. He's running against Republican nominee Richard Nixon. And between the two, Nixon was the one that really had all the experience. Nixon was the one that actually probably had the credentials to be the next president. What a lot of people um, think it kind of came down to is this is the first time you really had a debate that was held on TV. Um, Kennedy was younger. Kennedy was willing to listen to some of the TV executives who were telling him, hey, here's what's going to look good on TV. Here's what you should wear. He wore makeup. Nixon did not take any of that advice. So when it was on TV, a lot of people saw Kennedy as youthful, as somebody that had a lot of energy, looked good. Nixon was not any of those things, and ultimately, a lot of people believe that TV being better to Kennedy ultimately led to him being elected. First Super Bowl was held in 1967, Green Bay Packers versus the Kansas City Chiefs, with the Green Bay Packers winning. First Super Bowl was not the event that it is today. Back then, they struggled to get people in the stadium. They struggled to get it on TV. But it obviously has become a much bigger event today than it was back then. The Peace Corps was something that came about in the 1960s. It was, again, we're talking about that baby boom generation, and now they were getting older. They were graduating high school, and okay, our 1950s parents tell us that we have to follow the rules, we have to go to college, we have to go to the workforce. This was kind of like a way for that, 60s baby boomer kind of hippies generation to go against what the 1950s were all about. And that's really kind of an overlying thing about the 1960s, is that it's kind of counterculture. 50s, it was about following the rules. 60s, it's going to be about breaking the rules. So go into the Peace Corps. We'll go to the poorest parts of the world. We'll build huts, and we'll teach them English, and we'll teach them and we'll go and help out other parts of the world. And oh, by the way, it's kind of not what our parents wanted to do. So the Peace Corps is going to be something that comes into existence in the 1960s. A couple different projects that are going to happen in the 1960s with regards to the space program. The Apollo 11 mission, the moon landing, was July 20th, 1969. One small step for man, a giant leap for mankind. That's a famous saying. This is where that all took place. Okay. Some iconic shots the from the moon landing and the crew. Another thing popular during the 1960s, along with that counterculture that we were talking about, is the wearing of tie dye and hippies. If you look at the 1950s, what were the adults wearing? Well, the adults were wearing suits and ties, and they had. If you were a man, you had short hair. If you were a woman, you were wearing ankle length dresses, and you were all very proper, and you followed the rules. Man, what's more against the rules than wearing tie dye that can be in all different kind of funky colors and different shapes and sizes, and can be in different patterns, and something that can just be completely creative. The whole hippie culture is going to be a part of the 1960s, and it was all about, hey, if it's something that was done in the 1950s, we're not interested. We want to go the other opposite direction. This was a way of doing that. Because of the threat of nuclear war, fallout shelters became very, very popular. Here you can see in this ad, you could get a fallout shelter built in your backyard, let's say, for about $1,200. Pretty good deal. This is what a typical one would have looked like. You would have had some supplies down there, and the idea was it was supposed to protect you if a nuclear strike were to ever come. The reality was none of this stuff was going to be deep enough. It was not going to actually do what they claimed it was going to do, but it made you feel better about it. The Beatles are going to be one of the biggest acts. We said 1950s is where rock and roll is going to start. A lot of people say that the Beatles is what is ultimately going to drive it over the top and is going to make it so that people across America, different age groups, are all going to love rock and roll. The Beatles are going to be a part of it. Another thing that comes along in the 60s, music wise, is the idea of folk music. It's not that it didn't exist before that, but it's going to become kind of a mainstream thing. Why? Because it's anti establishment, anti following the rules. People like Arlo Guthrie, people like Bob Dylan, for example. November 2nd, 1963, the JFK assassination. We're going to take a day and we're going to talk a lot more about this, but just the idea he was in Dallas, was, riding around in kind of a parade. People had come out to see him, and ultimately he winds up getting shot and killed. A lot of people, at the time, it's been pinned on this man right here, Lee Harvey Oswald, who ultimately winds up getting shot by this guy Jack Ruby while he's being transported. But like I say, we'll talk a heck of a lot more about this in the coming days. 5 years later, on June 5th, 1968, his brother, Robert F. Kennedy, is going to be assassinated. He's giving a speech. He's running for office. He's giving a speech in California in a hotel, and he winds up being shot and killed as well. 60s fashion, once again, we're going to take what was in the 50s and we're going to kind of turn it on its head. Hey, this is, if you're more conservative, this is probably your look. It's still, a longer dress, but it does have some of the funky colors and styles of the 1960s. A younger crowd would have seen, bell bottoms, exposed midriffs, things like that would have become popular in the 1960s. Okay, more younger, you're probably looking something maybe a little bit like this if you're looking for a dress. For the men, again, just a kind of a change in the 1950s. You're talking about not a lot of color. It's going to greatly change during the 1960s, and you can see some kind of funky style. I don't know that I'd ever be caught dead in these pants here, or any of this right here, to be quite honest with you. But there again, we're trying to break out of the prim and proper mold of the 1950s and be somebody that's seen in the 1960s. So that's just kind of a quick rundown. Hopefully, we've gotten a little bit of information, a little bit of an idea what the 60s were all about.